Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Needy No More, the podcast dedicated to healing the anxious attachment style. I'm your host, anxious attachment style coach and author, Chris Ratcliffe. I've helped thousands of people across 6 continents to end the cycle of anxious attachment through my books, workshops, digital downloads, and 12-week coaching program. I'm excited to carry on that mission here in the podcast, sharing tools and techniques, principles and practices for you to explore on your journey to growing more secure. Welcome back to the show, everyone. I'm planning to post new content every 2 to 3 weeks moving forward. That feels like a more sustainable cadence for me as a solopreneur and someone who handles every single aspect of my professional life. So with that said, I'm excited to dive into today's episode, which is all about boundaries. We're going to be talking about the differences between boundaries and requests. We'll talk about why guilt is natural to experience when you're learning to set boundaries. We'll talk about the role of nervous system dysregulation in perhaps overcompensating when it comes to setting boundaries or being overly rigid or firm in our boundary setting, and so much more. The very first thing that I want to do today is to read a chapter from Needy No More, the book, which is all about boundaries. It's called Boundaries, Boundaries, Boundaries. So I'm going to read that first and foremost, and then we'll expand on some of the concepts that are introduced in that chapter in the remainder of today's podcast episode. So without further ado, here is the chapter from the book. When it comes to relationships, 5 of the most powerful words that you can ever wield are, "That doesn't work for me." This is the essence of a boundary, a guardrail for a given relationship based on what makes you feel most connected and respected. Your boundaries are based on your values, and your values aren't up for collaboration or negotiation. Those who truly care about you will want to know your boundaries because they'll want to know what makes you feel supported, understood, and cared for. They'll want to know the ways in which they can love you most loudly and effectively. A powerful quote that conveys the purpose of boundaries is from writer and somatics practitioner Prentice Hemphill, who says, "Boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously." Boundaries are firm but transparent. They don't keep people out, they help to bring them in. They communicate how you can love someone else while also loving yourself. A boundary is communicated out of love, not out of fear. It's an invitation to step forward together into a richer, more meaningful version of the connection. That doesn't always mean the other person will accept that invitation. That's also not why we set boundaries. Boundaries are just as much about honoring ourselves as they are about the relationship in which they're established. A relationship exists where the boundaries of each individual overlap. In this way, a lack of clear boundaries is a recipe for losing yourself in a relationship, and thus for codependency. Remember, no one comes with an instruction manual of how to be loved. We have to teach other people what works for us. They need to do the same. Boundaries are how that process unfolds. Boundaries are not requests, though we can certainly request specific adjustments when we're setting them. Think of boundaries like the property lines of the relationship. Just like your property lines aren't up for negotiation, neither are your boundaries. It's you saying, "This is what does and doesn't work for me in this relationship. This is what caring for me looks like. This is what I'm willing to tolerate here and what I plan to do as a result." Here's an example. Many anxious attachers deeply value connection and communication, vulnerability, and openness. As a result, many of our boundaries revolve around these values. It's absolutely okay to set a boundary with someone by saying, "I completely understand and respect that you're busy and have a life outside of our relationship, but I've noticed that we sometimes go extended periods without talking. That doesn't work for me. I'd like to talk about ways that we can connect and communicate more often that work for both of us. If we're unable to compromise here, I'm going to need to take a step back from this relationship." While you're leaving room for discussion around how to connect and communicate, you're not negotiating whether it's going to happen. A boundary is a statement. It's the declaration of the borders of the relationship in which you're willing to exist. as well as how you intend to enforce those borders. A request, on the other hand, is a question. It asks someone to make an adjustment to their behavior that in turn will help you feel more appreciated, supported, connected, and understood. Using the above situation with long lapses in communication as an example, a request might sound like, I'd like you to initiate communication a bit more by texting or calling me to check in throughout the day. Is that something you're able to do? Notice the inviting question at the end here. A boundary is showing someone where the door is and allowing them to open it and walk through. A request is asking them to hold the door for you as you both enter. Boundaries could be expressed as, next time I notice X, I will do Y because V is important to me. Take note of how the goal is not to change their behavior, X. The goal is to communicate what the ramifications of that behavior will be for you, Y, based on what you value most deeply, V. Requests, on the other hand, could be expressed as, instead of X, can you Z? In this case, we're directly asking for changed behavior, Z, rather than communicating how we'll change our behavior in response. In the end, boundaries and requests work hand in hand to help us communicate what does and doesn't work for us in that relationship, as well as occasionally what we'd like that person to do instead. Whether it's saying no or using the examples provided above, setting and keeping clear boundaries as well as making requests can be one of the most difficult parts of healing from anxious attachment and growing more secure. That's because folks like us are deeply afraid of losing people, pushing them away, or letting them down in any possible way, of rocking the boat or feeling like we're being too much. I know it was for me. For many years, I struggled to tell people what did and didn't work for me. But the more I learned to regulate my nervous system and take care of myself, the more I wanted to share with others how they could do the same. With practice, you'll learn to express your boundaries and stand firm in your power. You'll stop people-pleasing and peacekeeping. You'll take back control of your emotional well-being. You'll grow out of patterns of overextending yourself on behalf of others. Keep in mind that the folks who have most benefited from your lack of boundaries will likely be the most upset when you try to set firm ones. Do your best not to fall into the trap of taking this personally. It's not about you. If they truly value and respect you, they'll be more than willing to adhere to your boundaries and will express remorse for making you feel anything other than supported and appreciated. If you receive a different response to communicating a boundary, take note and respond accordingly with the energy you give and access you grant that person. That said, boundaries are never about trying to control the behavior of others. They are about expressing the opportunity for someone to choose to remain a participant in our story in such a manner that's in alignment with our values. Ultimately, boundaries are meant to increase connection, not diminish it. They support the safe expression of love, not the restriction of it. Boundaries lay out the lanes of this expression. It's time to stand firm in your values. It's time to stop abandoning yourself. It's time to learn how to set and keep healthy boundaries. Lastly, don't forget to set boundaries with yourself. The guardrails provided by boundaries also apply to the relationship we have with ourselves, and sometimes they're the most helpful of all. For instance, setting boundaries with yourself around screen time can help tremendously with your anxiety. Setting boundaries with yourself around when and how you use social media can be majorly helpful as well. I've had other clients who've set boundaries with themselves for how many drinks they'll have on a date with someone, or how long they'll allow the date to go before heading home. Still, others have set boundaries with themselves regarding the extent to which they'll be physically intimate with someone while in the early stages of dating. Reflect on your values and do what feels most aligned for you. Okay, so as we talked about in that chapter just now, there is a distinct difference between boundaries and requests. And many people confuse them because they're kind of similar, but their purpose is also different. So to remind you, requests are asking someone else to change their behavior, and boundaries are a chance to communicate what we will do to protect our own well-being. So, Boundaries are about what we can control or our actions, not about controlling somebody else's. So, for instance, if you said, please don't call me after 9 p.m., that's a request. If you said, if you call after 9 p.m., I won't answer, that's a boundary. You see the difference? And normally the request would take the form of a question. So you would say, can you please not call me after 9 p.m.? Or would it be possible to call me earlier than 9 p.m.? That's an example of a request. Whereas with the boundary, you're saying, if you do this, I'm going to do that. So if you call me after 9 p.m., I'm not going to answer. If you raise your voice and you yell at me and you get defensive, I'm not going to continue this conversation. I'm going to leave the room. Another example of a boundary there. Now, an important distinction as well is that boundaries are important with other people, which is kind of where our mind goes first, right? We start to think about how others may have violated our values or not acted in a way that made us feel loved or connected or appreciated. So maybe they know, and maybe you've told them, I want words of affirmation. I really like it when you compliment me, and they're not doing it. You can't control their behavior, but you can let them know what you'll do in response. Boundaries with others, yes, that is where most people's mind goes first. But boundaries with yourself, like I was talking about at the end of the chapter, are also very important. Boundaries with others usually take the form of saying no, or talking about your limits or what you're not willing to tolerate, creating distance. Boundaries with yourself have more to do with not overcommitting, with protecting your peace, with not allowing yourself to indulge your people-pleasing instincts or urges, and also with keeping your own promises. When it comes to setting boundaries with yourself, it's about how you spend your time and energy, right? So you have to reflect on the ways in which you might be misusing your time and energy, and then pull it back. And this is why in the chapter I talked about not only your devices, so your phone, your computer, etc., but also social media. Many anxious attachers will use social media to stalk people, to try to hunt and sleuth for information, to make themselves feel safer or to confirm their lack of safety, usually. What is this person up to? What are they doing? So setting those boundaries with yourself is really important. If you're breaking up with someone, going no contact is a great example of a boundary with yourself and with someone else. Setting boundaries with yourself can be challenging because you are both the enforcer and the enforcee. You're giving and receiving that boundary all in one. So keep that in mind and be gentle with yourself as you set boundaries. As always, harshness doesn't heal. Okay, so bring some compassion into this. Be gentle with yourself if you violate your own boundaries or you behave in a way that's not super supportive in terms of the relationship with your mind, your body, and your spirit. That happens, okay? Forgive yourself, process, firm up the boundary, move forward. Another point that I think is really important to make about boundaries is that they don't always have to be this big dramatic sit-down conversation like, hi, are you available on Thursday at 9 p.m.? There's something really important I want to talk to you about. Remember that a lot of communication is nonverbal. Not all communication has to be verbal. That is really important because sometimes your actions are the boundary. And sometimes it's just no, or no thank you, or I appreciate it, but I can't make that work, or that doesn't work for me, but hopefully I can make it next time. You can be gentle. You don't have to be overly blunt or rude while setting a boundary, but you can say no and thank them and move on. Okay, it doesn't have to be a, no, that doesn't work for me, and here's why, and this is the value that it's rooted in. For bigger values and for conversations that have maybe gotten delayed over time, you might need to do that. But for an everyday boundary, you can just say, I'm not available for that. That doesn't work for me. No, sorry, can't make it. I'll need to think about that and get back to you. Those are all examples of boundaries. You can keep it simple, clear, and calm. The next thing I want to talk about is the role of guilt here. Guilt is absolutely natural to arise when you are learning to set boundaries for yourself. Remember, as an anxious attacher, you're also a people pleaser. Your outward focus on other people will cause you to try to manage their response or their emotions. So you might think you're a bad person for setting boundaries. You're not. You might experience guilt or think that you've done something wrong. That's par for the course. It's a nervous system response to breaking old patterns. If you've learned to self-abandon, which many anxious attachers have, then when you learn to reassociate with your experience and stand firm in your truth, it's going to feel different and uncomfortable and like you're doing something wrong. That's just because it's unfamiliar. But your boundary itself is not wrong. Your brain might equate setting boundary with risking connection or potentially being abandoned. That said, if standing up for your boundaries and talking about what makes you feel appreciated and supported and connected, and if a boundary which invites deeper connection causes someone to disconnect from the relationship altogether, then it does naturally make you question how deep that connection was to begin with. Someone who truly cares about you is going to want you to tell them what works for you. They're not going to want to guess at it. They're going to want you to be clear and direct with them. And that process unfolds by setting boundaries. So you're actually doing them a service, not a disservice, by making clear what works for you. When it comes to setting boundaries, guilt is a sign of growth, not of failure. Okay? Be with that reaction that you might have. Breathe into the discomfort, sit with it, put your hand on your heart. Regulate the experience by being present with it and allowing the emotion to work its way through you, allowing the energy to pass. Now, sometimes when setting boundaries, we can actually put up walls. And I want to talk about why. A lot of this boils down to nervous system dysregulation. And if you've listened to the podcast to date, you've heard me talk ad nauseum about nervous system regulation and dysregulation. Nervous system dysregulation is one of the 6 core experiences of the anxious attachment cycle. And we explored that in an episode of its own. But it has ramifications elsewhere. A lot of people will be overly rigid in setting their boundaries to the point of it being a wall and shutting people out instead of inviting them in as a trauma response and as a reaction to nervous system dysregulation. So if someone's boundaries feel really drastic, really sudden, and come out of nowhere with no explanation, it's probably an overcompensation for not setting boundaries previously, which again is rooted in nervous system dysregulation. Remember, this is an overreaction to what's happening in the environment. But for them, it might feel like the straw that broke the camel's back. It might be the final thing that makes them feel like, screw this, I'm not doing this anymore. Either do this, love me in this way, or I'm out. And then boundaries can start to feel like ultimatums, even though the other person always has a choice, whether or not they want to step up and participate in that kind of connection and relationship. Think about it like this. When someone becomes overly rigid in their boundary setting, it's usually as a result of past violations of previous boundaries that they've set or of emotional neglect. So they're not necessarily responding to what's in front of them, and you might not be doing that either. You might be responding out of previous times where you've swept everything under the rug and wanted to be the cool guy or cool girl or cool person in order to not lose them. That can build up and accumulate over time until there's an overreaction. Overly rigid boundaries can look like ghosting, cutting someone off out of nowhere, avoiding vulnerability, just completely withdrawing from the connection. You know, there's a lot of similarities here to protest behavior. In fact, they're not mutually exclusive. You know, when you become overly rigid in any regard in how you connect with another person, it will take the form of protest behavior. You're overreacting and you're projecting all of that unprocessed energy and emotion onto them. The difference here is that these are fear-based and rooted in survival, not rooted in creating deeper connection or in your values. You can honor your desire for safety and connection simultaneously through learning to set boundaries that are inclusive and that welcome someone in versus pushing them away. Let's talk about a couple of myths when it comes to setting boundaries. These are kind of fun. The first one is that setting boundaries is selfish. No, it's not. It's self-responsible. As you heard me explain in the chapter from Needy No More, the book, setting boundaries is a path to a healthier relationship. It's that invitation to a deeper kind of intimacy and connection. So it's actually irresponsible not to set boundaries, not the other way around. All right, another myth is that boundaries push people away, and this is a big one for an anxious attacher. But the reality is, the truth is, only those who benefit from your lack of boundaries will be pushed away. Only folks who are only there because of what they can get from you as a result of you not having boundaries will be the ones that are pushed away. While there might be a temporary pause in connection because they might need time to process your boundary, and perhaps they might get a little defensive, some people do, comes up all the time. But people who care about connecting with you and who truly love you will come back and stay. They will say, you know what, I really appreciate you telling me that because I don't want to treat you in a way that makes you feel disrespected or misunderstood or unappreciated. All right, one more myth here. Once you set a boundary, that's it. You're all done. No, that couldn't be further from the truth. The truth is that you're going to often have to reinforce your boundaries and follow through on them over time. You may just have to gently remind someone like, hey, I know we talked about this. Can we revisit this conversation? Things like that. But know that it's not a one and done affair. You're going to have to firm up your boundaries from time to time and revisit those conversations. And that's absolutely natural. I also thought it would be fun to share some quotes that are all about boundaries and boundary setting and the benefits of doing so. I have 9 of them here that I want to share, and I'll talk about why each of them is powerful from my perspective. The first one is from the Queen herself, Brené Brown. She says, daring to set boundaries is about having the courage to love ourselves, even when we risk disappointing others. That is so powerful. I know so many of us are trying not to let other people down. That's also part of the problem because we're caregiving, we're managing their emotional experience instead of paying attention to and being rooted in our own values, our own experience, and helping to bring someone into that, which is what the process of boundary setting is all about. So this part here about even when we risk disappointing others is something I want each and every person watching and listening to this to reflect on. The courage to love ourselves even when we risk disappointing others. Yes, that's what this is all about. Second quote is from Tony Gaskins, who says, you teach people how to treat you by what you allow, what you stop, and what you reinforce. Woo! If only I'd learned that lesson earlier on in my life. We have to teach other people what works for us and what doesn't. As I mentioned in the chapter, we don't come with an instruction manual of how to be loved. That process unfolds by communicating preferences, by speaking up when something occurs that we don't like when someone might say something that we find offensive or make a comment about something that we'd prefer they do not. The next quote is from Annie Lamott, and she says, no is a complete sentence. Whew. Yes, it is. And that might feel harsh as an anxious attacher. No. 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 There's a lot of different kinds of no's. Keep that in mind. It's how you say it that matters, as with anything else. But this speaks to the point that I was bringing up earlier, which is that boundaries don't always have to be this big, in-depth, sit-down conversation. It can just be no, or no, or no thank you. Next, we have a quote from J.S. Wolfe, who says, those who get angry when you set a boundary are the ones you need to set that boundary for. Yeah, that's a really good point. Oftentimes, they're getting upset when you set the boundary because they benefited from it not being there. So this speaks to that. The fifth quote here is from Jessica Moore, who says, our boundaries define our personal space, and we need to be sovereign there in order to be able to step into our full power and potential. Yes, this is a great point. Because when you don't set boundaries, you're going to misuse your finite resources, your time and your energy. So actually, when you set boundaries, it reinforces and respects the need of your personal space and of that time and energy so that it doesn't leak out into your life in inefficient ways. The next quote is from Cheryl Richardson, who says, if you want to live an authentic, meaningful life, you need to master the art of disappointing and upsetting others, hurting feelings and living with the reality that some people just won't like you. It may not be easy, but it's essential if you want your life to reflect your deepest desires, values, and needs. Whew, yes. You're gonna ruffle feathers, people. It's okay. It is okay. And yes, you will lose some people along the way. But an honest conversation doesn't ruin real connection, and never forget that. Another quote here is from Laurie Buchanan, who says, "Just as we expect others to value our boundaries, it's equally important for us to respect the boundaries of others." Yes, I put this on the list for a reason, and it's coming back to me now. And that is because I haven't mentioned this today, but we need to reciprocate that as well. And that might be challenging at times too. And as anxious attachers, it might feel like they're pushing us away. Remember that this is a two-way street. They're inviting you into a richer form of connection that works for them. Process your reaction, thank them for telling you, and then do your best to respect that boundary moving forward. Next to last quote here is from Chase Hill, who says, "Stop asking why they keep doing it and start asking why you keep allowing it." Wow, that might be my favorite on the list. This is really super powerful. You play a role in any dynamics in your life relationally that you do not enjoy. You are also complicit in that, because if you truly wanted it to end, you would stand up and say, "No, I'm not tolerating that." And you would pull back your energy. Many of us don't do this, and that's part of the problem. Last quote here is from George Bernard Shaw, who says, "The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place." This speaks to something really important, which is that direct, clear communication is what leads to healthy intimacy and to secure connection. It is okay for some things to be left unsaid. Not everything needs to be vocalized, and that's not realistic to expect. Okay. We covered a lot of ground today, from boundaries versus requests, to boundaries with others and boundaries with ourselves, to respecting other people's boundaries and having them respect ours. Some powerful quotes here to wrap the episode. Why we're overly rigid in setting boundaries sometimes. Take some time to process this and journal or reflect on where in your life you might be overdue for a boundary, or where in the past you could have set a boundary in order to create a deeper kind of connection in that relationship. Where have you perhaps disrespected somebody else's boundaries? Because we're always the villain in somebody else's story, right? So where have you maybe gotten this wrong with other people as well? Reflect on those. See what comes to mind. If today's episode resonated with you, feel free to leave a comment on Spotify, to rate and review the podcast on Apple, on Spotify, or wherever you might be listening to this. And shoot me a message. My email is me@crackliff.com. CRACKLIFFE.com. I'll see you next time on the Needy No More show.